cutting off the head of the snake. That is the exact phrase United States Central Command used in an official statement to describe what American forces had just done to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps headquarters. Not degraded, not weakened, destroyed in a single large-scale strike that eliminated the physical command center of the organization, responsible for running Iran's entire military and paramilitary apparatus. Within the same 48-hour window, Iran's chief of staff was dead. Iran's defense minister was dead. The most senior military intelligence officer in the entire Islamic Republic was dead. 9 Iranian naval ships were sitting on the bottom of the sea. This is the story of how the United States and Israel systematically dismantled the actual brain of Iran's military command structure. Not the soldiers, not the equipment, but the people and the buildings that decide how that equipment gets used in the first place, and why the effects of that specific decision have continued rippling through this entire war ever since. Before we get into exactly how this unfolded, if you want to keep tracking the details behind every major strike in this war as they get confirmed, subscribe to this channel right now, because this specific operation represents one of the most significant command and control losses any modern military has suffered in an active conflict in decades. Let's start with the timeline, because the sequence here matters enormously. And understanding it in the correct order is the only way to actually grasp how devastating this specific combination of losses truly was for Iran's entire military and political apparatus. On February 28th, President Trump announced what he called major combat operations against Iran, launching massive joint American and Israeli strikes targeting military, government, and infrastructure sites across the country. That opening wave was already unusually aggressive, but what happened over the following 72 hours is what actually reshaped Iran's entire command structure going forward. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in the initial strikes. Just one day later, on February 28th itself, Saleh Assadi, the head of intelligence at Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya central headquarters, the country's military emergency command, was also killed. At the time of his death, Assadi was regarded as the most senior military intelligence official in the entire Islamic Republic's armed forces, and Israeli sources described him as directly involved in shaping Iran's strategic approach toward both Israel and the United States. Think about what that specific loss means operationally. This was not a field commander or a regional officer. This was the person whose entire job was synthesizing intelligence and shaping how Iran's leadership actually thought about threats from Israel and America. Remove that person, and every subsequent decision Iran's remaining leadership makes happens with a critical piece of institutional knowledge and strategic judgment simply missing from the room. Drop a comment if you think losing a figure like that matters more than losing a general with troops in the field, because there is a genuine debate among military analysts about which kind of loss actually does more long-term damage to a fighting force. Some argue battlefield generals matter more because they directly control troop movements and tactical decisions in real time. Others argue intelligence chiefs matter more precisely because they shape the strategic assumptions everyone above and below them relies on, meaning their absence corrupts decision-making at every level simultaneously, rather than just at the point of contact. The following days confirmed even more devastating losses. Iran officially confirmed the deaths of 2 additional senior commanders killed in the joint American and Israeli strikes: Abdolrahim Mousavi, the chief of staff of Iran's entire armed forces, and Aziz Nasirzadeh, Iran's defense minister and a former Air Force commander. Consider what those 2 specific titles actually represent within Iran's military structure. The chief of staff is the single officer responsible for coordinating operations across every branch of Iran's armed forces simultaneously. The defense minister sits at the political and military intersection, translating strategic decisions made by Iran's leadership into actual military policy and resource allocation. Losing both of those specific roles within the same short window does not just remove 2 individuals from the battlefield. It removes the entire coordinating layer that would normally be responsible for organizing Iran's response to exactly the kind of sustained multi-front assault it was actively experiencing at that exact moment. Make sure you are subscribed if you want the next update on how Iran's command structure has attempted to rebuild since these losses, because that rebuilding process itself tells you a lot about how deep the damage actually went. Iran's own response to these losses came in the form of a statement from the Revolutionary Guards confirming they had launched what they called extensive missile and drone attacks, targeting American military bases and Israeli sites across the entire region. According to that statement, the strikes specifically targeted 27 separate American bases, along with Israeli facilities, including the Standoff Air Base, the Israeli Army's command headquarters at Hakiria in Tel Aviv, and a major defense industrial complex within the city. Tehran's statement promised what it called a different and harsh step of revenge, delivered through successive, regrettable slaps, language that reflects both genuine anger and, notably, the limitations of what Iran's remaining command structure could actually organize in direct response to losing so much of its senior leadership at once. This is exactly where the phrase military brain becomes the right way to understand what actually happened here. A military force is not simply a collection of weapons, vehicles, and soldiers. It is a coordinated system that depends entirely on command, intelligence, and decision-making functioning correctly at every single level, from the Supreme Leader's office down through the Chief of Staff, the Defense Ministry, and every regional and unit-level commander beneath them. Strike enough of those specific decision-making nodes simultaneously, and you do not just weaken the military. You temporarily blind and confuse it, forcing whatever leadership remains to make critical wartime decisions without the intelligence, assessments, coordination structures, and institutional experience that would normally guide those decisions under less chaotic circumstances. That specific kind of injury, invisible on any equipment inventory or troop count, is precisely the kind of damage that tends to matter most in the months and years following a war's most intense opening phase, long after the physical rubble from individual strikes has already been cleared away. Let's talk specifically about the IRGC headquarters strike itself, because CENTCOM's own choice of language here was deliberately significant. Describing the operation as cutting off the head of the snake is not accidental military press release phrasing. It is a direct statement about strategic intent, specifically targeting the Revolutionary Guard's actual command infrastructure rather than simply degrading its equipment or personnel in the field. The IRGC functions as far more than a conventional military branch inside Iran's overall structure. It runs its own navy, its own air force, its own intelligence apparatus, an extensive paramilitary and proxy network stretching across the broader Middle East. Destroying its physical headquarters strikes directly at the nerve center, coordinating all of those separate functions simultaneously, rather than picking off individual pieces of that broader network one at a time. It is worth pausing on exactly what it actually takes to execute a strike campaign this precise, because destroying command headquarters and killing specific named individuals within a compressed 72-hour window is not something that happens through luck or improvisation. Striking a chief of staff, a defense minister, and a senior intelligence officer within days of each other requires exceptionally detailed real-time intelligence about exactly where each of those specific individuals were located, at exactly what moments, information that almost certainly required months or even years of prior surveillance, human intelligence sources, and signals intercepts built up well before the war's opening, strikes ever occurred. This was not a campaign improvised in the days immediately following February 28th. The sheer precision on display, hitting named senior officials, rather than simply striking buildings and hoping the right people happened to be inside, points directly to a level of pre-war intelligence penetration into Iran's senior military and political structure that itself represents a remarkable and underappreciated part of this entire story. That level of intelligence penetration also explains why Israel's own parallel strikes against dozens of separate command centers achieved what its military statement described as such a severe blow to Iran's overall command and control capability, coordinating strikes against that many distinct facilities simultaneously, each one requiring its own specific targeting data, requires an intelligence and operational planning apparatus operating at a scale most outside observers likely underestimated going into this war. Iran, for its part, has spent years investing heavily in counterintelligence specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of infiltration and targeting of its senior leadership, following the lessons it drew from watching Israel systematically eliminate senior Hezbollah and Hamas leadership figures in prior conflicts. The fact that Iran's own countermeasures still failed to prevent this scale of loss against its own senior military leadership suggests either a significant intelligence failure on Iran's part, an extraordinarily sophisticated penetration effort on the part of Israel and the United States, or most likely, some combination of both factors working together simultaneously. Alongside that specific strike, Trump publicly confirmed a separate but related piece of devastating news for Iran's military capability. In a post on Truth Social, Trump stated he had been informed that 9 Iranian naval ships had been destroyed and sunk, some of them relatively large and important vessels within Iran's fleet. He added a direct warning that the United States was continuing to pursue Iran's remaining naval assets, promising they would also be floating soon at the bottom of the sea. In a separate operation described the same day, Trump indicated the United States had largely destroyed Iran's naval headquarters entirely, a second command and control facility lost within the same brutal stretch that had already claimed the IRGC's own headquarters. Israel's own military reported conducting parallel strikes against dozens of separate Iranian military command centers during this same period, specifically including facilities belonging to the IRGC, Iran's broader intelligence headquarters, IRGC Air Force command centers, and internal security headquarters. According to the Israeli military's own public statement, These coordinated strikes inflicted what it described as a severe blow to Iran's overall command and control capabilities, specifically resulting in the elimination of personnel stationed inside these critical command facilities at the moment they were struck. The loss of the IRGC's physical headquarters specifically carries implications that extend well beyond Iran's own domestic military structure, because the Revolutionary Guard has spent decades functioning as the Central Iraq and Yemen. Every one of those separate proxy relationships, historically managed through the IRGC's own Quds Force and coordinated through the broader command structure housed at the headquarters CENTCOM specifically targeted, depends on a functioning communication and coordination channel back to Tehran to remain strategically aligned rather than destroying that specific physical headquarters, alongside eliminating the senior personnel who staffed it, does not just disrupt Iran's own domestic military coordination. It potentially disrupts Tehran's ability to coordinate and direct its entire regional proxy network simultaneously, a consequence that extends the practical impact of this specific strike campaign well beyond Iran's own borders and into every theater across the broader Middle East where Iranian-backed forces operate. The naval headquarters strike deserves its own separate examination as well, because Iran's naval strategy throughout this entire conflict has depended heavily on exactly the kind of centralized coordinate ion that a destroyed headquarters building directly undermines. Iran's approach to contesting the Strait of Hormuz, deploying IRGC fast attack boats in coordinated swarms, timing mine-laying operations, and directing missile and drone strikes against commercial shipping, requires real-time coordination between multiple dispersed units operating across a wide geographic area simultaneously. A functioning centralized naval headquarters is precisely the kind of infrastructure that makes that level of coordination possible in the first place. With that headquarters largely destroyed, alongside 9 separate naval vessels sunk in the same window, coordinated maritime harassment campaign using a command structure that was significantly degraded before that campaign ever fully got underway. That specific circumstance helps explain some of the apparent disorganization observed in Iran's later attempts to reassert control over the strait, including the reported confusion Iran's own forces experienced regarding the exact locations of mines they themselves had laid earlier in the conflict. A mistake far more likely to occur within a command structure still working to rebuild basic coordination capacity than within one operating at full institutional strength. Think about the cumulative scale of what actually happened here across just a few days of fighting. The supreme leader, killed. Tihi, most senior military intelligence officer in the country, killed. The chief of staff of the entire armed forces, killed. The defense minister, killed. The IRGC's physical headquarters, destroyed. The Navy's physical headquarters, largely destroyed. 9 naval vessels, sunk. Dozens of additional command centers across the IRGC, intelligence services, IRGC Air Force, and internal security apparatus struck directly with personnel killed inside them. That is not a series of isolated tactical victories happening to occur near each other in time. That is a systematic, deliberately coordinated campaign specifically targeting the entire decision-making architecture of Iran's military and security state within an extraordinarily compressed window of just a few days. This is precisely why analysts covering this conflict describe the specific phase of the war differently from the strikes that came before or after it. Hitting individual weapon systems, missile launchers, or even nuclear facilities like Fordo represents an attempt to degrade Iran's physical capability to fight. Hitting the actual command structure, the people and buildings responsible for deciding how that remaining capability actually gets used, represents something categorically different. It is an attempt to induce genuine institutional paralysis at exactly the moment an adversary most needs clear, coordinated leadership to respond effectively to an ongoing multi-front assault. And there is real evidence this specific strategy achieved at least some of its intended effect. Iran's retaliatory response following these command losses, while genuinely significant in scale, striking 27 American bases and multiple Israeli sites simultaneously, still reflected the kind of broad, somewhat scattered response pattern you would expect from a military apparatus operating without its normal top-level coordination fully intact. A fully coordinated Iranian command structure, with its chief of staff, defense minister, and senior intelligence leadership all still alive and functioning, would presumably have been capable of a more precisely sequenced, strategically targeted response than the broad, simultaneous barrage Iran actually launched across so many separate targets at once. Let's talk about the succession crisis this specific combination of losses eventually triggered, because it did not stay confined to the military chain of command for very long. Losing Khamenei as supreme leader alongside the chief of staff and defense, an extraordinarily rare and dangerous combination for any government to absorb at once, let alone one already fighting an active multi-front war. Iran's constitutional process for selecting a new supreme leader normally involves lengthy deliberation among the assembly of experts, a body designed for careful, drawn-out consensus building rather than rapid wartime decision-making. Forcing that entire process to happen under active bombardment, with the very body responsible for making the selection potentially itself at risk from further strikes, represents exactly the kind of institutional stress test few modern governments have ever had to survive in real time. Reports following the initial strikes indicated Mojtaba Khamenei, the late Supreme Leader's son, emerged as the figure ultimately positioned to take on leadership responsibilities, though the process by which that transition actually occurred remained murky and contested for weeks afterward. A succession happening under these specific circumstances, following the violent death of the previous leader during active combat, alongside the simultaneous loss of the country's top military coordinators, is fundamentally different from a planned, peacetime transition of power. Every decision the new leadership made in those early weeks carried the added burden of establishing legitimacy and authority while simultaneously trying to coordinate a military response to an ongoing war, using command structures that had just lost most of their most experienced senior personnel. This overlapping crisis, a wartime succession happening on top of a decapitated military command, likely explains much of the apparent hesitation and inconsistency that characterized Iran's official statements and military decisions during this specific period. Multiple competing factions within Iran's remaining power structure, the Revolutionary Guard's surviving leadership, the more conventional Artesh military branch, and whatever remained of the political apparatus around the new supreme leader, all had to quickly establish some kind of working relationship and decision-making hierarchy, all while foreign strikes continued and the war itself showed no signs of pausing to allow that internal reorganization to happen calmly. Analysts studying authoritarian regimes under this kind of simultaneous internal and external pressure have long noted that this exact combination, a contested succession happening during active military crisis, represents one of the single most dangerous and unpredictable situations a government can face, precisely because different factions within the remaining leadership often have genuinely different assessments of how aggressively to respond to continued external pressure, with no single figure holding enough unquestioned authority to definitively settle those internal disagreements quickly. There is also a longer-term consequence to this specific kind of strike that extends well beyond the immediate battlefield, and it deserves genuine attention here. Military institutions do not simply plug new people into vacated leadership roles overnight and continue operating at the same level of coordination and experience the previous leadership had developed over years or even decades. Whoever eventually filled Mousavi's role as chief of staff, whoever took over as defense minister after Nasirzadeh's death, whoever replaced Assadi as head of military intelligence, all of them inherited positions requiring institutional knowledge, established relationships across the broader command structure and battlefield judgment that simply cannot be transferred instantly. That gap between formal authority and genuine operational competence represents exactly the kind of vulnerability that tends to persist for months or even years after this kind of decapitation strike, regardless of how quickly the formal organizational chart itself gets refilled with new names. There is a more recent and even more directly comparable precedent worth examining closely here, because Israel had already demonstrated a version of exactly this kind of decapitation strategy against Hezbollah in Lebanon just 2 years before this specific war against Iran began. Israel's campaign against Hezbollah's senior leadership, including the killing of longtime leader Hassan Nasrallah and a broader sweep of the organization's senior military commanders, alongside the extraordinary sabotage of Hezbollah's own communication devices, produced a documented measurable collapse in the organization's ability to coordinate a unified military response in the weeks that followed. Hezbollah, despite retaining a substantial arsenal of rockets and missiles, was widely assessed by military analysts to have suffered a genuine breakdown in coordinated command capability following that specific campaign, unable to sustain the kind of large-scale, precisely sequenced retaliatory operations it had previously threatened for years. If an organization as deeply entrenched and experienced as Hezbollah suffered that scale of operational disruption following the loss of its senior leadership, a comparable or even more severe loss inflicted on Iran's own senior military command, an organization with less recent experience absorbing this specific kind of decapitation strike, should reasonably be expected to produce at least a comparable level of disruption, if not considerably more, given the added complexity of Iran's simultaneous succession crisis happening at the political level as well. There's also a psychological and morale dimension to this kind of strike that rarely gets the attention it deserves in strategic analysis, even though military historians consistently point to it as one of the most significant and longest-lasting effects of any successful decapitation campaign. Soldiers, officers, and mid-level commanders throughout Iran's broader military structure, people who never met Mousavi or Nasirzadeh personally and had no direct role in the losses themselves, nonetheless absorbed a genuine psychological shock Upon learning that their nation's most senior military leadership had proven vulnerable to this level of precision targeting, that kind of shock tends to produce measurable, if difficult to quantify, effects on morale and risk tolerance throughout an entire military structure, well beyond whatever specific coordination gaps the strikes created at the top. Commanders further down the chain of command, aware that their own superiors had just proven reachable by exactly this kind of precision strike, often become more cautious, more hesitant to concentrate forces or communications in ways that might make them similarly vulnerable. A behavioral shift that itself further degrades overall military coordination and responsiveness, independent of whatever specific personnel losses occurred at the very top of the command structure. There is historical precedent worth understanding here, because military decapitation strikes of this scale and precision are relatively rare events, and the ones that have happened before offer useful context for what typically follows. The United States killing Qasem Soleimani in a targeted strike back in 2020 removed a single, extraordinarily influential commander from Iran's broader regional strategy. And even that single loss produced years of documented disruption to how Iran coordinated its proxy network across the Middle East. What happened during the opening days of this war goes dramatically further than that earlier precedent, removing not one influential commander, but the supreme leader, the chief of staff, the defense minister, and the most senior military intelligence officer simultaneously, alongside the physical destruction of both the IRGC and naval headquarters buildings themselves. If losing Soleimani alone produced years of measurable disruption to Iran's regional coordination, the scale of loss inflicted during this specific window of the war represents an order of magnitude beyond that single earlier precedent, and the disruption to Iran's internal military coordination should reasonably be expected to persist for a comparably extended period, if not considerably longer. It is also worth examining how this specific kind of strike differs fundamentally from the broader strategic bombing campaigns that have defined most of the rest of this war. Strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, oil refineries, and coastal military infrastructure are primarily about degrading physical capability, reducing how much Iran can actually produce, refine, launch, or defend with over time. Strikes against command and control infrastructure specifically target something much harder to rebuild quickly: the actual human expertise and institutional relationships required to use whatever physical capability remains effectively. A country can rebuild a destroyed refinery in months, replacing the accumulated decades of institutional knowledge held by a nation's chief of staff, defense minister, and top military intelligence official, all lost within the same short window, is a fundamentally different and far slower K-in of reconstruction, one that depends on developing genuine experience and trust across a command structure rather than simply pouring new concrete or importing new equipment. Consider also the specific timing of these losses relative to everything Iran was simultaneously managing. This decapitation of Iran's senior military leadership happened during the exact same window Iran was also absorbing strikes against its nuclear facilities, fighting to maintain control over the Strait of Hormuz, and beginning what would become a months-long internal succession crisis following Khamenei's own death. A fully intact, fully coordinated command structure would have faced serious challenges managing that combination of simultaneous crises under normal circumstances. A command structure that had just lost its chief of staff, defense minister, and top intelligence officer within the same 72-hour window faced that exact same combination of crises with a critically reduced capacity to coordinate a coherent response across all of them at once, which likely explains at least part of why Iran's overall strategic response throughout the following months has appeared reactive and inconsistent rather than clearly planned and executed from a position of coordinated strength. This also helps explain a pattern that has repeated itself throughout the months since these initial strikes: the recurring cycle of ceasefires, violations, and renewed strikes that has defined this entire war. A military and political leadership structure, still working to rebuild its own internal coordination and institutional memory, is inherently more prone to inconsistent decision-making, mixed signals, and factional disagreement about how aggressively to respond to any given provocation. Some of the apparent contradictions in Iran's behavior throughout this war, agreeing to ceasefire terms one week and then testing those exact same terms days later, may reflect genuine internal disagreement among a leadership structure that lost so many of its most senior, most experienced decision-makers within the war's opening days. Iran's own official confirmation of these specific deaths, rather than any attempt to deny or minimize them, is itself worth noting. Regimes facing this level of leadership loss sometimes attempt to obscure the actual scale of the damage, both to maintain domestic morale and to avoid signaling weakness to adversaries actively monitoring the aftermath. Iran's decision to officially confirm the deaths of Mousavi and Nasserzadeh specifically, rather than keeping that information ambiguous, suggests the scale of the loss was simply too significant and too visible to plausibly deny, particularly once foreign intelligence services and international media had already begun reporting the same names independently. There's also a question worth asking about how this specific loss compares to what would happen if the United States or another major military power suffered a similarly compressed leadership loss. Losing a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a Secretary of Defense, and a top military intelligence official simultaneously, alongside the physical destruction of major command headquarters buildings, would represent an absolutely unprecedented crisis for any modern military, regardless of how large or well-resourced that military's remaining physical capability happened to be. The fact that Iran absorbed a comparably severe blow to its own senior leadership within days, while simultaneously managing an active multi-front war, a collapsing nuclear program, and eventually a succession crisis following its supremes. Leader's death helps explain why so much of Iran's subsequent conduct throughout this war has appeared less like a coherent, centrally directed strategy, and more like a series of reactive decisions made by a leadership structure still working to reestablish basic coordination across its own remaining institutions. International reaction to the scale of this specific command decapitation was itself notable, with the United Nations Secretary Jean Rahl warning publicly about catastrophic consequences if the broader war continued escalating along these lines, a statement that reflected genuine international alarm, not just about civilian casualties, but about the broader instability that can follow when a major regional military power suddenly loses this much of its senior leadership simultaneously. Regional governments across the Gulf, several of whom depend on some degree of predictable, rational Iranian decision-making to manage their own security planning, found themselves suddenly forced to plan around a version of Iran whose actual command structure and decision-making process had become significantly less predictable and less transparent than it had been just days earlier. That kind of regional uncertainty, a major military power's internal command structure becoming genuinely opaque even to its own neighbors and rivals, tends to produce exactly the kind of miscalculation risk that makes already volatile conflicts even more dangerous, since surrounding governments can no longer reliably predict how a weakened, reorganizing Iranian leadership might respond to any given provocation or perceived threat. None of this means Iran's military capability has been permanently crippled in some absolute sense. Iran retains substantial missile stockpiles, drone production capacity, and a large, geographically distributed network of forces and proxy relationships across the region that a single decapitation strike, however severe, cannot instantly eliminate. But capability without coordination is a fundamentally weaker version of military power than capability paired with experienced, functioning command structures. And that specific distinction is exactly what this particular phase of the war targeted so directly and so effectively. Rebuilding that lost coordination, unlike rebuilding a damaged refinery or replacing a destroyed missile launcher, cannot simply be purchased or manufactured on any accelerated timeline. It requires years of accumulated experience among a new generation of commanders who were never meant to hold these specific roles this early in their careers, working together, to rebuild the exact kind of institutional trust and operational fluency that took their predecessors decades to develop before this war ever began. So where does this actually leave Iran's military going into the later stages of this war? A force that retains substantial equipment, substantial personnel, and a still functioning, if visibly weakened, chain of command, but one that lost, within a matter of days, the specific individuals and physical infrastructure responsible for coordinating how all of that remaining capability actually gets deployed. That distinction matters enormously for understanding everything that has happened in this conflict since. Iran has continued fighting, continued launching strikes, continued targeting, shipping in the Strait of Hormuz and military bases across the Gulf. But it has done so as a military still working to rebuild the actual decision-making architecture that normally sits behind those individual tactical actions. A gap that helps explain both the intensity and the apparent inconsistency that has characterized so much of Iran's behavior throughout the months following this specific phase of the war. If this breakdown helped you understand why this specific round of strikes mattered so much more than a typical exchange of fire, hit that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want to understand the actual strategic significance behind these events rather than just a running tally of who struck what. And if you want to catch the next update on how Iran's command structure continues attempting to rebuild after losses this severe, make sure you are subscribed. Because a military missing this much of its actual brain does not simply return to full strength overnight, no matter how quickly the org chart gets refilled with new names, and the consequences of that specific gap are likely to keep shaping how this entire war unfolds for months to come. Every strike, Every negotiation and every ceasefire that has followed this specific decapitation campaign carries the invisible fingerprint of that opening 72-hour window, whether or not most coverage of this war ever pauses long enough to connect those two things together.